Across the table, the fake Patrick began rearranging the serial letters on the outside of his bowl. He spelled out 3 words: I-H-A-T-E-Y-O-U. Then he folded his hands and stared at her, with that strangely vacant look, as though the black part of his eyes had eaten up all the colour. Liza's insides shivered again. She slid off her chair and went over to her mother. She tugged at the sleeve of her mother's nightgown, which had a small coffee stain at its elbow. "Mummy." "Yes, Princess?" she asked distractedly. "Patrick's freaking me out." "Patrick?" Mrs. Elston said, without looking up from her notepad, on which she was now scribbling various figures. "Stop bothering your sister." Here's what the real Patrick would have done. He would have stuck out his tongue, or thrown his napkin at Liza in retaliation, or he would have said, "It's her face that's the bother." But this impostor did none of those things. The impostor just stared quietly at Liza and smiled. His teeth looked very white. "Mom!" Liza insisted, and her mother sighed and threw down her pencil with so much force that it bounced. "Please, Liza," she said with barely concealed impatience. "Can't you see that I'm busy? Why don't you go outside and play for a bit?" Liza knew better than to argue with her mother when she was in a mood, so she went outside. It was a hot and hazy morning, far too hot for late April. She was hoping to see one of the neighbours out doing something, watering a plant, walking a dog. But it was very still. Liza almost never saw the neighbours. It was not that kind of neighbourhood. She didn't even know most of their names. Only Mrs. Kostenblatt, who was so old she looked exactly like a prune. Today, as on most days, Mrs. Kostenblatt was sitting on her porch, rocking and fanning herself with one of the Chinese delivery menus that were often stuck, mysteriously, invisibly, in the middle of the night, under the front door. "Hello!" she called out to Liza and waved. "Hello," Liza called back. She liked Mrs. Kostenblatt, even though Mrs. Kostenblatt hardly ever moved except to rock in her chair, and could not be counted on to do anything interesting. "Would you like a glass of lemonade?" Mrs. Kostenblatt called out. "Or a cookie?" She offered Liza lemonade and a cookie every time they saw each other, unless it was winter, in which case she offered hot chocolate and a cookie. Mrs. Kostenblatt liked to rock, even in cold weather, and she would appear on her porch so bundled in blankets and scarves she looked like an overstuffed coat rack. "Not today, thank you," Liza said regretfully, as she always did. She was not allowed to accept things to eat or drink from non-family members. Liza often wished the rule applied to family members instead. She would much rather have had one of Mrs. Kostenblatt's cookies than her Aunt Virginia's tuna casserole. She wondered whether she should tell Mrs. Kostenblatt about Patrick, but decided against it. 2 weeks earlier, at recess, when she had tried to tell Christina Millicent and Emma Wong about the Spindlers and the constant threat they posed, they had laughed at her and called her a liar. Mrs. Kostenblatt was a good listener. Partly, Liza thought, because she couldn't hear very well, but Liza didn't want to risk it. There was only one thing that Liza hated more than liars, and that was being accused of being one. At one edge of the yard, a pile of pine cones had been neatly stacked. Liza had arranged them this way only yesterday, thinking that she and Patrick might play a round of pine cone bowling in the morning. But of course she could not play with a false Patrick. He would no doubt find a way to cheat. She had a sudden, wrenching, fierce desire for Anna, her old babysitter, to come home. She would have played pine-cone bowling. In fact, she had invented it. Last fall, Anna had gone away to college, which meant that she had moved and couldn't babysit anymore, and instead Liza and Patrick were left with Mandy, who always chewed her gum too loudly and didn't like to play games. She didn't like anything, really, except talking on the phone. Anna had come over to babysit several times during her Christmas vacation, but on her spring break she'd gone away with her friends. Liza and Patrick had gotten a water-warped postcard from her, but most of the writing had been too blurry to read. In addition to the postcard she had sent from the beach, she had sent 2 letters from college, and a white sweatshirt with a fierce-looking bear on the front, explaining in the attached note that it was her school's mascot. Patrick had cried like a baby when it turned out the sweatshirt was in Liza's size, and she had finally lent it to him. He had promptly spilled tomato sauce on it, and she'd refused to speak to him for